Good morning. Starting off today, I was perusing a little bit of news and I ran across an interesting video and it just kind of triggered in my mind a couple of thoughts. Because as we all know, the U.S. doesn't like to fight a stand-up fight. The U.S. says publicly a fair fight is no fight that we're interested in. So they're always looking for a way to undermine regimes and stretch forces out in many different ways. And I found this incredibly interesting because it ties into the news currently that's going on. And news that, we'll call it future news and obscure news. Let's get started. Be sure that you hit the like, make sure you subscribe, and let's get started with this. It is a 4-minute video, a very interesting one.
Turkestan Islamic Party, a secretive force that some thought was virtually non-existent, now rising to prominence as part of the rebel coalition that toppled Assad in Syria. They've released a series of propaganda videos showing step-by-step preparations for what became the final successful push. Fighting on the front lines against Assad's forces, firing off a rocket near the city of Sarakib, explosive gun battles, entering Latakia, a strategic port city, then victory rolling in on tanks cheered by the public. TIP was founded in the 1990s with a footprint in Afghanistan and Pakistan. For the last decade, they've been based in Syria. Their field commander, Abu Muhammad, also known as Zahid. Years ago, TIP members escaped from China, where they faced severe oppression and human rights abuses. Often they fled with their families. Since then, they've set up villages and training camps in Syria, made inroads with militant groups like Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, which led the recent offensive, and built a vast fighting force. After Syria, now China. TIP has always been clear. The end goal? Independence. To liberate their homeland of East Turkestan from the Chinese occupiers. TIP fighters are mostly Uyghur Muslims. Uyghurs as a whole have faced decades of persecution under the Chinese Communist Party. More than 1 million people forced into re-education camps. Thousands imprisoned for praying and fasting, what Beijing considers horrific crimes. TIP propaganda highlights grievances against the Chinese state. The 1990 Barron Uprising, when anti-government protesters were all shot by soldiers. Many, possibly thousands, were killed. The real death toll unknown because the government covered it up. The Chinese Communist Party rules with an iron fist, a zero-tolerance policy for anyone who dares to challenge the state. For TIP, fighting alongside others in Syria was just the first step, and China, the final retribution.
Şerik başarının yallalmaları kanda kaçkan bolsa Allah'ın izni bilen, Allah'ın kudreti bilen, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala cebareti bilen biiznillah bizning Ürümçide, Aksu'da, Kaşgar'da aldığımızda Aşkıtay kafirlemişin Kaşgar'da okşar kaçır biiznillah azze ve celle.
Can TIP take the fight to China? Home to the world's largest military with 2 million active troops. It's easier said than done. Still, TIP could target Chinese projects or embassies abroad. China is very likely to push for the extradition of TIP members. This will be a sticking point for the new Syrian government in building relations with Beijing. A founding principle of HTS was to protect foreign fighters that joined the insurgency. In exchange, they had to promise not to use Syria as a launch pad for attacks elsewhere. It's unclear how strong TIP really is in terms of numbers and firepower. What happens next remains to be seen. Either way, TIP is no longer in the shadows.
Is that possibly the next proxy force? Using Syria as a training ground, allied with other proxy forces, already allied with Western interests, we'll just put it like that, Turkish equipped. Those were clearly Turkish fighting vehicles. The small arms you saw were up to date, especially in that video of the guy talking specifically about Homs and going after China. The U.S. isn't just going to go at China with just U.S. versus Taiwan. It's going to be multiple different fronts. And I saw this and I instantly thought, new proxy force. New U.S. controlled proxy force. Even if it isn't U.S. controlled, we'll call it U.S. adjacent. If they're not fighting exactly for U.S. interests, they're clearly not fighting against U.S. interests. And I absolutely see this as a future proxy force. As things kind of settle down, not being the right word for the Middle East at any point in history, but as things downscale, a lot of these forces will essentially move east. You keep hearing in the news that the next target is Iran. They'll just move through Kurdistan. The Kurds are certainly for getting rid of any of these people. Obviously, they just need to survive because the Turks are trying to eliminate them and have been for hundreds of years. This force moves east and begins terrorist acts in China, begins flat-out attacks. China won't be merciful. They will not be merciful. And a proxy force needs to be pretty substantial if it's going to stand up to the People's Liberation Army, that's for sure. But I thought this was an interesting video. It clearly shows a little bit of, I think, long-term thinking. Because the Uyghurs have been in the news on and off for a while now. We all know of their plight. The Chinese clearly are oppressive. And you could see a justification in the Western media for supporting, we'll call them TIPs. TIPS was their acronym. Turkish Islamic Party. Turkestan Islamic Party. TIP. We'll call them TIPs. I believe TIPs will be at the tip of the spear, pun completely intended, of whatever ends up happening with China. I do believe that the United States has a proxy force now that will be a thorn in the side of the Chinese in the western part of their, can't even call it their country because they're occupying Turkmenistan. So in the western part of their holdings, holding down forces, creating dissension. Again, I found this very interesting. Something you put in the memory bank and you say, I heard about that. When in 3 or 4 years, you hear about them. But for now, that's all I got on this. I do appreciate you, and I do thank you for stopping in. We'll catch you next time.